Hello Cohort B, and welcome to the Unit 3 team case presentation about unconventional monetary policies, presented by Team 3, the Central Bankers, which includes Michael Benson, Ben Chung, Rob Kenny, Shannon McDonald, and Amanda Stortboom. Our discussion this week focuses on monetary policy and the role that it played in recovering from the 2008 global financial crisis. By definition, monetary policy is the way in which a government stabilizes the economy by controlling the amount of money in the system and how it moves around. Growth requires an ample supply of money that moves quickly from one party to the next. Economists talk about this growth equation as GDP equaling the supply of money multiplied by its velocity. If supply and velocity are too high, we worry about the economy overheating and take steps to cool it down or contract the economy. Some may have seen discussions about this in the US media just last week. But if supply and velocity of money is too low, we talk about the economy being stuck or stalled, as in Q1 of 2016. And at these times, steps are taken to expand or stimulate the economy. Monetary policy, in essence, is the day-to-day balancing of these forces to create stability, and it's the job of a government central bank to do this work. In Canada, our central bank is the Bank of Canada. In the United States, it's the Federal Reserve, also called the Fed. It's important at this point to distinguish between monetary policy and fiscal policy. The terms are sometimes confused, so it's important to differentiate because the concepts are quite different. Whereas monetary policy is focused on the health of the economy overall, fiscal policy is more controversial because it's a particular government's approach to taxing and spending. Fiscal policy is often rooted in ideology and forms the core of any election platform or government agenda because it speaks directly to how much a particular government will extract from its taxpayers and what it will deliver back to those taxpayers in the form of debt or deficit reduction or government programs and services. And while governments use both fiscal policy and monetary policy to influence the economy broadly, they are in fact very different tools. So let's dig a little deeper into monetary policy. As mentioned, central banks work every day to manage the appropriate speeding or slowing of the economy. They have a suite of tools available to address changes within what would be perceived as a range of normal or usual circumstances. Rudebush describes these as conventional monetary policies, and they fall into three main categories. First is interest rate targeting, and this involves the central bank raising or lowering the central interest rate to make money essentially harder or easier to access. The second is bank reserve requirements, where the central bank demands that banks keep more or less in their reserves, and in doing so they restrict or free up the availability of money for loans. Third is open market operations, and this involves the central bank injecting money into the system by buying assets from banks, usually in the form of bonds, or drawing money out of the system by selling assets. A 2013 review by the IMF states that prior to the 2008 global financial crisis, central banks and advanced economies navigated calm and familiar seas. Essentially, this monetary policy was conducted in a relatively predictable and systematic way. But if we reflect on the 2008 global financial crisis, I think we'd all agree that it was anything but calm, familiar, predictable, or systematic. The tools that had been successful for so long proved ineffective. And the challenge was complex in that it involved both financial market activity on Wall Street, as well as real economic activity, the actual buying and selling of real goods and services on Main Street. Further, the traditional model of monetary policy was challenged along three additional and important dimensions. First, there was massive disruption created by the major global financial players like Lehman Brothers and Bear Stearns that were either hobbled or failed altogether. Investor, creditor, and consumer confidence was shaken to the core, and liquid assets became frozen. Institutions and individuals who had money were so shaken that they hung on to it. Third, the severity of the crisis forced most countries to zero or near zero interest rates and some into the negative, leaving policymakers looking for innovative ways to stimulate the economy, given that they could not reduce interest rates further. In total, the traditional policy levers were simply not relevant or effective in the wake of the financial meltdown. As a result, central bankers pursued unconventional temporary monetary policies to restore macroeconomic stability with two key objectives. The first, unfreeze the money, specifically getting money out of the hands of those that had it and into the hands of those that needed it. In economic terms, we talk about restoring the financial market functioning and financial intermediation, which simply means getting the money moving again by channeling the funds from lenders to borrowers. The second objective was to find new ways to stimulate the economy when interest rates were already at or near zero. To do this, central bankers developed and implemented four unconventional policies: quantitative easing, credit easing, forward guidance, and negative interest rate policy. I'm going to turn it over to Rob to take us through each policy and some of the related implications and outcomes.
Thanks, Shannon. Let's look now at the characteristics of unconventional monetary policy, or UMP. UMP measures are extraordinary approaches that are undertaken as an exception to provide additional monetary relief in times of critical financial recession and when conventional policy is not able to effect the desired changes to key financial and economic indicators. As Shannon noted, conventional policy typically manages the economic engine through the central bank interest rates. However, when lowered interest rates approach the zero lower bound, which is at or near 0%, unconventional policy becomes necessary. UMP is typically implemented through the use of four types of tools: quantitative easing, credit easing, forward guidance, and negative interest rate policy. Quantitative easing and credit easing are essentially referring to the same thing. The central bank is creating more money and purchasing long-term securities in order to increase lending and spur economic growth. Interest rates are kept low in order to improve credibility and confidence in the central bank. Quantitative easing refers to the act of creating more money, while credit easing is using this new money to buy long-term debt like the mortgage-backed securities in the United States that were the major issue behind the 2008 crisis. When the supply of money goes up, interest rates go down. When interest rates are low, people and businesses typically borrow more and spend more, so the economy sees growth. This is a Keynesian method of promoting consumer spending and aggregate demand in order to stimulate economic growth. Quantitative easing was a significant part of the UMP tools utilized in response to the 2008 financial crisis. As can be seen on this chart, the U.S. Federal Reserve increased its direct holdings of financial assets nearly fivefold in the period between 2008 and 2014, from $870 billion to over $4.4 trillion US dollars. This massive increase in direct government action was in an effort to manage the effect of the 2008 crisis and the ripple effect it caused throughout the global financial system. Forward guidance consists of promises made by the central bank specific to its future actions. According to the IMF, commitments to keep interest rates low for an abnormal duration contribute to managing expectations of future policy decisions and therefore create expectations of a stronger recovery. Such promises, when deemed credible, will lead the public to believe that inflation will be high in the future, enticing them to leverage credit and spend more today. Ironically, this approach is intended to stimulate the economy through a commitment to be irresponsible with rates in the future. Randau and Kennedy explain that negative interest rates are an act of desperation, a signal that traditional policy options have proved ineffective and new limits need to be explored. They punish banks that hoard cash instead of extending loans. A negative central bank rate means commercial banks will actually incur interest on funds they deposit with the central bank. Negative interest rates are used to incent commercial banks to invest their excess funds into further lending or other market avenues, rather than depositing them with the central bank. Negative rates further aim to devalue the country's currency in the hope that it will spur inflation. It is important to note that negative central bank rates rarely translate into negative rates for the public due to the interest rate premium that commercial banks add to the central bank rate when setting their market rates. though some commercial banks in countries with more extreme negative rates have begun to charge larger customers for their deposits. Randall and Kennedy warned that negative interest rates may also have the undesired effect of incentivizing banks to take additional risks in search of profit. As can be seen by the chart on the left, Japan, the European Central Bank, Sweden, Denmark, and Switzerland have implemented negative central bank rates ranging from minus 0.1% to minus 0.75%. These rates have a further effect on the yield curve of government bonds, such that the return on many of the bonds of these nations actually incur negative returns, depending on the term of the bond. In other words, at this point, if you buy a 10-year government of Switzerland bond, it will actually be worth less than you paid at the end of the 10 years. The use of UMPs by the major central banks has changed the very nature of their role. According to the IMF, prior to 2008, central banks were simply the lenders of last resort to compensate for market impairment, but this changed drastically in the recent financial crisis, with runs on bank deposits, collapse of consumer and investor confidence, self-reinforcing asset price escalation, and major borrowing constraints. Although the crisis has now stabilized, it's unclear whether the central banks will be able to return to their previous role of distanced observers and controllers of the interest rate. Any attempt at such a withdrawal would need to be clearly communicated in order to prevent a loss of confidence. As Santor notes, quantitative easing has created an economic environment where the high supply of money has become almost normalized. For example, even though the US is raising its policy rate, it still has maintained its asset holdings. UMPs have created an economic environment where money has been more available, and changing this could prove difficult both politically and technically. Political leaders will certainly want to avoid any economic change that could jeopardize economic recovery or growth in their respective countries. This is true for both advanced economies and emerging market economies, since their respective growth is closely linked in this globalized market. Santor further explains that on a practical level, the central bank could incur losses if it must sell its assets, resulting in a loss of confidence, and this would be bad for policy reputation. The IMF has stated that the further impact of this could be a volatile interest rate, and long-term rates could prove difficult to control, thereby undermining the recovery of financial stability and investment that had been achieved through the use of quantitative easing. Although challenges will exist in the withdrawal of UMPs, these measures were always intended to be temporary in nature. If UMPs are not withdrawn, and they become the new way of doing business, the risk is that corporations and investors will adapt in response, and UMPs will actually serve to promote even riskier behavior than before the crisis. According to the IMF, concerns include the possible mispricing of credit risk, riskier positioning by weaker pension funds and insurance companies, and a rise in liquidity risk. Naturally, as economies recover, the continued need for UMPs will decrease, and other structural measures will need to be implemented for long-term changes. So, what are the key takeaways from this presentation? UMP provides tools to manage the economic engine in extreme cases. The 2008 financial crisis was a significant shock to the system and required drastic action to avoid a complete meltdown. UMP, while necessary at certain times, should be a temporary solution. Balancing the implementation of UMP is a difficult task, and it can have both positive and negative effects. Ultimately, UMP will not fix a broken system. As noted by the IMF, monetary policy itself cannot solve structural banking problems or raise potential growth in the medium and longer runs. Thank you for listening to our presentation. We hope you found it informative. We would like to leave you with 2 discussion questions to consider. Number 1, as a business leader, what opportunities or risks do you see in a post-2008 global market? Number 2, unconventional monetary policy requires significantly more direct action by government in the financial markets as compared to conventional monetary policy. Do you feel this level of involvement is necessary or beneficial, or would we be better off letting the free market happen as it will?